So good afternoon. We're going to get started. I'm Connie Kazri. I'm in the HDP division, and this represents our HDP symposium that we got to choose. So our HDP faculty came together and we wanted to choose someone who would represent both our interests in HDP, but also sort of the broader field. And so in terms of that, we were thinking of somebody who studied both typical and atypical development, who does translational research. So, for example, from experimental studies into homes and communities, and and also does developmental neuroscience. And so when we think about that, the first and probably the only person that came to mind was Chuck Nelson, Charles Nelson III. I'm sure there's a story there. And so I think particularly because Chuck studies development in context and really is a developmental neuroscientist by training, he's perfect for representing the human development program. So we're really honored today that Chuck accepted our invitation, although I would imagine that was pretty easy given that Boston has been snowed in for weeks. And so, although he told me this morning that winter is his favorite season, which is shocking to me. But given that he, really? Right, so he got his bachelor's degree at McGill, and then took some detours to University of Wisconsin, University of Kansas, University of Minnesota, and worked there for a while. So you've been in the winter, so you know winter, and now is in Boston. He's currently a professor at Harvard in graduate school of education, psychology, public health, psychology, neuroscience, and pediatrics. Anything else? Did I leave out any department? So in other words, all of Harvard is claiming you.
Most of the schools, yeah.
Yeah, most of the schools he has an affiliation with, which is quite amazing. Okay, so he has, just so you know, over 266 experimental papers, and 11 books, and 63 chapters, and many, many presentations, and he does work on a global, in a global context. So I know about the work in Romania. He's also, I think, going to talk a little bit about work in Bangladesh and some other places. And so we're really, really happy to have you here.
When I was putting this
Good title.
Yeah, so first, this is Connie's title, which I only realized yesterday when I was finishing this talk, and I realized I had the wrong title. Connie asked me to sort of speak a little bit to more international work, but let me take a step back and just say that I have a long-standing interest in how experience impacts brain development, and as is the case with many people with that interest, I have drifted into the domain of bad things. So I mostly focus on the negative. What happens when bad things happen early in life? How does that impact brain and behavioral development? So before I start and talk about a specific project, I want to open up with this issue of why we would conduct international research when there's so many domestic issues concerning the lives of children in the United States. So I'm sure all of you have different answers for this question, but I thought I would just give mine, because there's many reasons for doing international research. This is on my mind because last week I was giving a talk at the American Museum of Natural History in New York with Nim Tottenham, who used to be here, and another faculty member at Columbia. And the other faculty member said, I don't know why we're spending all this money doing all this international stuff when we have all these problems here in the United States. And I said, certainly we have a lot of problems that need to be resolved in the United States, but there are other reasons to do international work. So in my case, I look for extreme environments, cases in which, in order to address a scientific question, I need to find a population that represents an extreme of some sort. So in my work on autism, an example of that would be studying populations that have a high risk of developing autism, an enriched sample. In the work on diversity, it's a matter of saying, what what are extreme cases? So I'm going to talk about one today, but I'm going to briefly now mention two others. For the last years, I've been working in Brazil, where we have a project up in the north in Salvador, and very soon back in Sao Paulo, where we're looking at kids growing up in incredibly stressful environments, usually neighborhoods. These are favelas they grow up in, for those of you who know that term. These are neighborhoods of incredible violence, domestic violence, neighborhood violence, family violence, and the like, as well as all the other levels of adversity. In Bangladesh, a project that we're about to start in the next week or two, the goal there initially was to study early brain development in a low-resource country. And it's now morphed into looking at sort of a full range of adversity that confronts young children in the first few years of life, and how does that impact on brain development. So in Bangladesh, of course, these are often kids growing up in very poor neighborhoods, where the rate of, on the one hand, on the psychosocial side, these could be kids growing up with mothers who are depressed. 30 to 40% of the mothers have a depression. On the medical side or biological side, almost all of them have chronic GI issues. They have malabsorption issues, they're stunted. So there's a whole host of adversities. Now, as a neuroscientist, that creates a challenge. If I was studying the mouse or the rodent or the monkey, I can control and manipulate experiences and control and manipulate environments. But when you study the human, you're kind of stuck with the hand you're dealt. So that's my reason for doing the international work. It isn't just to accumulate a lot of frequent flyer miles. It's more a matter of working in parts of the world that allow me to answer a question. And then, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk, to see if we can use that science to improve the lives of children. So the other thing Connie asked me to do is to sort of insert some discussion of policy at the end of my talk, which I'll do. But for now, what I'm going to focus on is this very specific problem that occurs throughout the world, and it has to do with children growing up in institutions. So we know that throughout the world, institutional care is common. UNICEF estimates that there's probably 100 million orphaned or abandoned children around the world, and 2 to 8 million live in institutions. Actually, some have said that 8 million is a conservative figure. So let's assume at least 8 million kids live in institutions. And we know that institutional care, or congregate care as it's sometimes called, is a common form of care for orphaned or abandoned kids in much of the world: Europe, Asia, Middle East, Central, South America. So right now, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, there are orphanages everywhere. In Sierra Leone and Liberia, there are orphanages everywhere to take in the orphans due to the Ebola crisis. So in South Africa, there was an HIV issue. In Eastern Europe, kids were orphaned often because they were abandoned, and then they were put into state-run institutions. So part one is institutional care is common throughout the world. What's interesting is that this is not exactly a new problem. So this is the title page from a JAMA article published in just about 100 years ago, January 2015. The best conditions for the infant thus requires a home and a mother. The further we get away from these vital necessities of beginning life, the greater will be our failure to get adequate results in trying to help the needy infant. Strange to say, these important conditions have often been overlooked, or at least not sufficiently emphasized by those who are working in this field. So we've known for quite some time that kids who grow up without parents don't have the same developmental outcomes as kids who grow up with parents. I should quickly add, this is not all parents, right? So much as there's a range in the quality of institutional care, there's also a range in the quality of family care, and we can all readily think of examples of really horrible families. Right? So it's an old problem for which we need a new solution. So, I was going to say fast forward, but really I want to go backwards, fast backwards. 1997, Bill and Hillary Clinton hosted a conference at the White House on early brain development. Ironically, there was only really one neuroscientist invited to this, Carla Schatz, but the rest were posed as neuroscientists. And from that, the media got a hold of this and said, oh my God, there's critical periods, and brain development is over by the age of 3. There were New York Times editorials about this. I spent a lot of time with journalists discussing this, and I was thinking, have you ever seen a 3-year-old? I mean, do they really look like they have a mature brain? But somehow people got into their head that brain development ended at the age of 3. And so at this time, I was a member of a research network funded by the MacArthur Foundation, the David Cuthbert Chair. David who's most recently known for being the head of the DSM-5 committee. And in that network, Floyd Bloom, who was then the editor of Science, he and I anchored the brain behavior element of our psychopathology and development network. But we didn't look at kids below 4. Turns out that Murray Gell-Mann, who got the Nobel Prize for discovering quarks, and Jonas Salk, who got the Nobel Prize for the Salk vaccine, have been members of the MacArthur board, and they got interested in neuroplasticity, and they persuaded the foundation that they should pay more attention to early brain development and plasticity. So I got tapped to be the director of a research network on early experience in brain development, in part because of what had happened at the White House conference. So we put together a group of about 10 of us or so, including Marion Sigmund, who was a member of this group.
We're going to mic you. Because it's, you know why? Because this room has terrible acoustics. So it's not you, it's the room, it's just hard with the tall ceilings. Can you guys hear in the back? Sort of. Would it help to mic them? Yeah. So
Is this mild surgery?
Yeah, but it's all surgery.
Yeah, okay, fine.
You're moving them up to the speaker back there. Okay. You're going to walk around with it? So should I wait? I shouldn't start yet.
Do you need to plug it in?
I think it's batteries will work for the oil, but yes.
Hello? No? No. Is this on? That was okay. There we got it. Does that seem really loud to anyone else? I put this. Okay, I'm going to put it down here. Is it working if I leave it down here?
Yeah.
Okay. So, we put together this research network. Marion Sigmund was a member of this research network. Our job was to look at how experience impacts brain development. Mostly neuroscientists in the group. We did work with barn owls, we did work with rabbits, we did with rats, we did work with monkeys. But we were looking for an opportunity to look at how experience impacts human brain development in a controlled way. And it turned out that we had this opportunity to do a study in Romania, and that's going to be the focus of my talk. So the project is referred to as the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, and it had 3 goals. Examine the effects of early institutionalization on brain and behavioral development, to determine if these effects can be remediated through an intervention, in our case, foster care, and then to improve the welfare of children in Romania by establishing foster care as an alternative to institutionalization. So now let me give you some background to this project. Nicolae Ceausescu was the communist dictator who ran the country from 1966 until 1989. Is this still okay?
Yeah, we're good. I'm just going to plug it, so I'm working.
All right. So, 1966, Ceausescu has this idea that he will increase his power if he increases the population. So he then put into play a series of decrees to increase the population. They included the following. He established the menstrual police. These were state gynecologists who went into the workplace to examine all women of childbearing age, make sure they weren't using birth control and that they hadn't had an abortion. If they had more than 5 kids, they didn't get an exam. Harvard decided they wouldn't adopt this policy. They didn't like the idea. That was a joke. I did that with my undergraduates as well. They established a celibacy tax. Any family that had fewer than, well, the way it worked was, if you had more than 2 kids, you got a stipend. But if you had fewer than 5, you were taxed. So basically, you were taxed if you had fewer than 5 kids. And then he outlawed all contraception and abortion. So between the state gynecological exams and the prohibition on abortion and birth control and the tax, the birth rate skyrocketed. And as a result, child abandonment became a national disaster because families couldn't afford to keep their kids. And he conveniently built state-run institutions throughout the country to warehouse these kids, arguing to families that under a communist system, the state would do a better job of raising kids than families would. Scott? You're late.
Okay, now the ice is broken. I'll just try to find a seat. Are you sure?
1989, there's a coup in Romania. Ceausescu is overthrown in the coup and then executed, all of which is on YouTube. And at which point, the Western media floods into the country and starts reporting on the conditions that they found there, which was more than 170,000 kids who had been warehoused in institutions throughout the country. Poverty was the #1 reason, but we all know that there are many poor people who don't abandon their kids. So there was more going on in this, including the fact that they were getting the message that the state would take care of these kids. The media started reporting on this, and many families in the West, particularly the UK, Canada, and the United States, started adopting kids who came out of these institutions. And what these families were not prepared for is how some of the developmental challenges that these kids faced. And as a result, many parents were at their wits' end about how to take care of these kids. I don't know, but these are some still pictures. I took all the videos out because I find them a little too depressing of what institutional care is like in Romania, although it's really no different than many other parts of the world. So you'll see lots and lots of babies lined up in cribs, usually staring at a white ceiling, and they stay in those cribs until they're at least a year. You can see over here the sheer number of kids that one caregiver is taking care of, and it's difficult to tell who the boy is and who the girl is because they're dressed alike and they're given similar haircuts. That's part of the idea of sort of taking away their individual identity. So we need to ask the question, why might institutional care be bad for the brain? So it's a very regimented daily schedule. Kids eat at the same time, sleep at the same time, toilet at the same time, very, very regimented. That it's non-individualized. You'll often see, for little older kids, mass feedings. So a caregiver will sit there and shovel food into 2 or 3 kids' mouths at the same time. And for babies, instead of holding the baby and feeding the baby, what they'll do instead is hold the baby under their arm and just put the bottle like this or shovel food into their mouth. There's a great degree of sensory, social, emotional, cognitive, and linguistic deprivation that is no response to distress. What's interesting about this, if you walk into an institution, many institutions are very quiet because kids have learned not to cry because no one pays attention to them.
Wow.
Unchecked aggression, lack of psychological investment by caregivers, a high child-to-caregiver ratio, in our case, 12 to 14 kids for every caregiver, and rotating shifts of caregivers. So it could be the day shift, the evening shift, and the night shift taking care of the kids. We've known for many years, at least 50 years, that kids raised in institutions are at a high risk for a variety of social and behavioral problems, including disturbances in social relatedness and attachment, externalizing behavior problems, inattention hyperactivity, deficits in IQ and executive functions, a syndrome that mimics autism. I should say that in our sample, 5% of our kids meet criteria for autism, and Mike Rutter in the UK has a study of Romanian adoptees into the UK. He reports 10%. Growth stunting, which I'll show you in just a minute. And the assumption is that these developmental problems are believed to result from the deprivation inherent in institutional care. So you should be thinking, how old are these kids, and are these boys or girls? And this is a 17-year-old girl, and this is a 14-year-old girl. So as a rule, in bad institutions, and I'll qualify that in a minute, kids lose about a month of linear growth for about every month they spend in an institution. So in one of the institutions that we go to now for adolescents, what we see is 15 to 18-year-olds, none of whom are taller than this on me. And it's not like I'm a towering figure. So the growth stunting is not, as a rule, due to the kind of stunting I'll see in Bangladesh. This is not malnutrition. This is failure to thrive. So people who work in child protection commonly will see kids who are neglected who don't grow. And the assumption is that the brain is not producing growth hormone. It's not clear, at least to me, why that happens under conditions of profound deprivation. Suffice to say, that growth stunting is a big issue. And before I do the study design, I should add something. We assume, and this is something that Nim Tottenham and I have spent a lot of time talking about, all institutions aren't created the same. There are some institutions are better than others, the way some families are better than others. But there's irrefutable evidence that if if you partial out bad families, that kids who grow up even in the best institutions don't have as good developmental outcomes as kids who grow up in families. And the classic study on that topic is work by Tizard in the 1960s. So these were babies who had been abandoned by their moms, and it was a nursing school. So these were highly motivated, well-educated, very well-intended young women who took care of these kids. Very good ratio, like 2 kids per caregiver or something like that. As they followed these kids, they had normal IQs, but they still had the same disturbances in social and emotional development that you would see in my study that I'll talk about in just a minute. So there's a continuum of care from truly, I took out a video that shows an institution in northern Romania that is just completely heartbreaking to watch. So you have a continuum of care from awful to better, but it doesn't cross the line into what a family should be. And this is non-trivial because there's big policy implications for this work, which I'll talk about at the end, where many governments still reflexively put kids in institutions rather than to find alternatives to institutional care. So the network I mentioned before, this McCarthy network, spent the better part of a year kind of designing the study as a group. And it became the first ever randomized controlled trial of foster care as an intervention for the social deprivation associated with institutionalization. We screened more than 180 kids to make sure that they didn't have an obvious genetic, chromosome, neurological problem, or fetal alcohol syndrome. But it was all done in physical exam. We weren't drawing blood or anything like that, so there were some limits to it. But still, we screened more than 180 kids who were young, less than 2 or so. And of the 180, we landed on 136 that we considered to be typically developing as much as we could determine that, who ranged in age between 6 and 31 months. And at the time we did a baseline assessment, the kids averaged 20 months of age. So keep that in mind. We then did the randomization. 68 of the kids were randomly assigned to remain in the institution, and 68 were randomly assigned to go to foster care. And then we had a sample of 72 kids who grew up with their families in the greater Bucharest community who had never been in an institution. That's sort of our in-country comparison sample. We saw them at the baseline when they were 20 months. Then we saw them again at 9, when they turned 9, 18, 30, 42 months, 54 months. By this point, I'm saying we're done with the study because I'm tired of going to Romania. Then we saw them again at 8, we saw them again at 12, and now we're seeing them at 16. And my 2 colleagues, Charlie Zinn and Nathan Fox, claim that we're going to be seeing them as they make the transition to adulthood, which is 6 years from now. I then point out how old those 2 guys are, and that's not going to happen. An important point to emphasize, well, I'm going to deal with the ethics of this study in just a minute, but I want to first deal with the domains of assessment. Charlie Zinn is a child psychiatrist, particularly interested in attachment, social and emotional development. Nathan Fox is a developmental psychologist, affective neuroscientist, interested in cognitive development, emotional development, and the like. And so as a result, between the 3 of us, we kept having these arguments what we should study in these kids. They were clearly not resolved, because this is the list of things that we study. So basically, since the kids were 8, it's a 4-session assessment battery, meaning the kids are seen over 4 separate days to get through this whole battery. I'm not going to talk about all this, I'd be here for a long time, but I'm going to talk about a few key things that I thought would be of interest to you today. But now let me talk a little bit about the ethics, and then I want to pause to make sure we go into the rest of the talk with no ethical concerns. So the first issue is, why was this done in Romania? And one was, there were 170,000 kids living in institutions in Romania, and bar none, there was no country on earth that had that looked this bad in terms of institutionalizing such a large number of kids. The second is, it was an opportunity to study the role of adverse experience, sort of an extreme environment in the context of brain and behavioral development. A third is, we were invited into this country to do this study. And the way this worked is that when we started this, I was at the University of Minnesota, and I had a colleague who, although was a neonatologist by training, started the first international adoption clinic in the United States. And he, I was cross-appointed in pediatrics, and he'd say to me when we met, I have all these kids in my clinic who look like they have autism, who look like they have this or that, and they come out of institutions. Why do you think that is? And we had no idea. So we invited Dana to one of our network meetings, and he showed some video, and then he told us that he had been taking care of kids in Romania for many years, just as a physician. So he told us that there was a minister of child protection he had met who wanted to close down institutions and stop putting kids in institutions. But no one else in government was on board with this because they felt that this was the right thing to do. So he thought if a scientific study was done, that would lend more credence than simply taking the high road, the way Americans love to moralize and say you should do this. Rather than do that, he thought let's use science to do this. So he invited us in to do the study, and he arranged for our lab space and all of that. Of course, within a year of getting there, he was thrown out of office. But by then, we were under the radar and started our work, and there were no more flare-ups, even though he was no longer with us. Although we did have the then U.S. ambassador to Romania was a huge ally of ours. And for those of you who do international work, forming the right partnerships is absolutely essential to success. Because of this guy in the government, there was an interest in developing policies for intervening in the lives of abandoned children. And the issue was institutional care better than another form of care, like foster care? Many people believed foster care was evil, that no one would take a child into their home if they weren't biologically related unless they had evil intentions towards that child. So people just didn't believe in foster care or adoption for that matter. So the idea was then to pit institutional care against a form of family care. So we have informed consent from all the US universities and from all relevant Romanian agencies, and we get permission from the guardians or the caregivers of all the kids in the study. The reason we could do random assignment was the following. In a city of several million, there was a bias against foster care. So we did extensive advertising to find foster care families. And after they were screened with a psychiatrist, psychologist, and a social worker, we could only identify 58 families that we thought would be good foster care families. And we were going to create a really high-quality foster care program. And we didn't want to take any chances, so we were very conservative. So there were only 58 families. So what we did is we kept siblings together, and in so doing, had 68 kids that we could put in foster care. There was no more treatment to go around, and that's why the other kids stayed in the institution. But it was by random assignment, and that's critical to understand because that minimizes sample bias by doing it that way. We had a policy of non-interference, and what that means is that we expected over time that kids might be removed from the institution by the authorities and reunited with their biological families or maybe eventually adopted or put in foster care. We wouldn't interfere with that. We also had a policy that any kid we put in foster care would never go back to an institution, and that meant we had to form close ties with members of government and with non-governmental organizations to make sure that that didn't happen. So kids were free to change their group assignment. And once the efficacy of the intervention was established, we gave the information to the government, encouraging them to change policies. So when you do a clinical trial like this, an RCT, let's say it's for diabetes, and everyone in the room has diabetes, this half gets the new experimental drug, this half gets placebo, and after a few months we find out we've cured your diabetes, I either give everyone the drug or I stop the trial, because it's referred to as clinical equipoise. It can't be unbalanced. In our case, we didn't have any more treatment to go around. We only had 58 families. If we stopped the trial, the kids we put in foster care would go back to the institution. So we did something else that we refer to as shaming. We worked with this ambassador. We called a press conference to which we invited members of the government and the media, and we announced our findings. And we said, the kids we're placing in foster care are doing much better than the kids who stay in the institution, which on its own was amazing because many people had adopted the Soviet principle of defectology, which is the kids in institutions are defective. And by default, the reason we see problems in institutionalized kids is they went in defective, and therefore putting them in a family wouldn't do anything at all. But we announced that that wasn't the case, and as I'll talk about later, that then led to changes in policy. Within a year, they passed legislation forbidding the institutionalization of any kid under 2. And then we have a data safety monitoring board in place. For those of you who were involved in clinical trials know what this is. We have an independent board that participants, families, and participants can go to report if something happened that they felt uncomfortable with, they were pushed too hard, or something like that. So the last thing I'll say is that there have been more than a half a dozen articles written by us and others on the ethics of this study. We published an IQ paper in 2007, and there was a commentary written actually by Ezekiel Emanuel, who's Rahm Emanuel's brother. And there's another Emanuel producer, isn't there, in Hollywood named Emanuel? But Ezekiel is a bioethicist. His commentary was longer than our article. There was another commentary that appeared in Nature Neuroscience. So a lot has been written about this, and I'm happy to send these papers to you, just to assure you that a lot of thought has gone into the ethics of this work. So now let me pause and see if there are any remaining questions about the ethics of this. Okay. I'll tell you one a medical student helped me with. She said, I understand why you wanted only healthy kids in the study, but I think it's unethical that you didn't allow special needs kids into the study. And the reason is that why deprive them of benefiting from the study? My answer to that was, the government was very suspicious of us. They did not think we'd see any effects. If we had entered kids who had handicaps and didn't see any benefits, the government would use that as evidence that, see, we're right all along. Institutions are just fine for kids. Having said that, then the hope is to do another study with kids, of course, with special needs. And in fact, there is a study like that being run by Bob McCall from Pittsburgh and St. Petersburg, where it's an institution specifically for special needs kids. Okay, so a little bit about the foster care, and then I'll start getting into the data. So I told you we screened these families. The families were provided the following. We gave them a monthly stipend that was equivalent to the average per capita income in Romania at the time. This was a big IRB issue. We couldn't pay them too much, and we couldn't pay them too little. So we sort of figured out what the average family made, and that's what we paid the families. They were very closely monitored. Social workers visited the homes every 10 days, and roughly every 7 days, the social workers met with us via Skype or in person to sort of talk about the problems they were experiencing. So let's say Connie took one of these kids in, and she was finding the kid didn't want to take a bath, or it was difficult feeding. We would consult on that. So there was sort of built-in intervention, which is, of course, another ethical issue. We couldn't just turn a blind eye to kids who were struggling. We tried to help the families. But if you think about the U.S. child protection system, it is rare for social workers to visit a family every 10 days and then have consultation like this. All material support was provided, like diapers and toys. We had a 24-hour on-call pediatrician. Romania law required that one parent stay at home. The kid couldn't be in daycare when they were little. So as a result, and all families were licensed. So this was very high-quality foster care. And the way the trial worked is we maintained this foster care program, which cost us more than the actual science of the study, through 54 months. And at 54 months, we stopped supporting the families and the follow-up phase began. But to give you one example of how invested these families were, 30 of them adopted their kids. So that says something about how they feel about it. Yeah. You bet you first.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I'm just curious, because of the 58 eligible families, what was your pool of families you pulled from? I mean, how different are these 58 families from the families you had to exclude, which you didn't find them eligible?
Oh, you know, actually, I don't know how to answer that. I thought you were going to ask a different question. So you're saying that if we, I don't know how many we screened, but let's say we screened 100 families, how did these 58 differ from the other 42? That's what you're asking, right? I don't know the answer to that, but I can try to find out and get back to you. What I thought you're asking is how did they differ from the families of the never institutionalized kids? And it turns out there they didn't. When we looked at measures of quality of maternal care using the ORCI, which is a measure, the observational record of the caregiving environment, it was as high in our foster care families, not government foster care, as it was in the never institutionalized families. In the San Diego.
So, this foster care arrangement was to go on when the kids were between 20 months and 54 months? So
Well,
about
20 was average. There were kids as young as 6 months, but it was from the point of randomization on.
So on average, these families agreed to take care of these kids for about 2 to 3 years?
No. That's an interesting question. These families psychologically were buying into the idea that these were then their kids, and they were going to forever. There was no hint that we were going to stop the study or stop the trial. That the arrangement we made with the government was that once we placed these kids and we took care of foster care, at some point the government would take over.
So that was part of my question. So you didn't know that families would want to keep the kids, and in fact, you said 30% did. Some gave them back. So what was your ethically? What did you weren't going to send them back to institutional care? What did you think you were going to do with them?
That they would stay in those foster care families forever.
But the families weren't required to do that. They were buying into a study that went on for a certain
Absolutely,
amount of time.
absolutely. What we arrange is, again, the kids we put in foster care, that we said that we would find a way that no kid would ever go back to an institution. And the way that would work is that the government would either then support our families, or the kids would move to government foster care, which happened in some cases. But the kids would never go back to an institution. Now, having said that, that worked beautifully until the last 2 or 3 years, and the kids got to be adolescents. And now 3 of the kids have gone back to an institution. One, for a reason we didn't anticipate, the foster care mother died. And the other 2 is the kids were threatening to kill the foster care mother. I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself, but one of the more severe forms of mental health we're worried about is callous and emotional traits. And we have a couple of our kids who are threatening to kill and so that's why, yeah.
So you said that there were only 58 families that were eligible, and I was actually curious what you provided the families, how that compares and contrasts with kind of what the typical foster family in Romania would receive. So how much of a bump up was this financially, but also in terms of the other resources you were providing?
If you didn't have a question in the back, is what's the difference between our foster care families and government foster care families across several different criteria, like how much they're paid and the like. So one is that they're not monitored nearly as closely, services aren't provided, they're not paid nearly as much. The tragic thing is that when this worldwide recession hit a few years ago, Romania cut back on what it was paying government foster care families, which led a lot of them to give their kids back up to institutions. So for those of you who have worked in the child protection system, one of the things we're now modeling is the number of placement changes. And it turns out that's not trivial. I'll get to this in a little bit, I think, but we have a paper coming out in Lancet Psychiatry on our 12-year mental health data. And one of the things that matters is the stability of placement. Which doesn't come as a surprise, right? So that's an issue we've struggled with because we have no control over this because the government makes these decisions. So, anything else? Okay.
I have
Yes.
one. So it's interesting to hear in the beginning that with the press conference, the government was kind of shamed. But now in this next portion, it was kind of given up that the responsibility shifts to the government in total. And so at one end, there was this really forceful effort to ensure that a certain path would be taken. And then now on the second end, the effort was not the same. And so how then ethically do you rectify the type of force that as a study and as a researchers you're willing to put on one end, but not let that be the same at the other end?
Okay, I was following you right up until the end. So try this one more time, the last part of what you were saying.
So then how then do you reconcile ethically that the kind of force, the support, the resources, the tactics that you're willing to do to ensure something that happens is to be shaming the government? But then not at the other end you say, oh, it was just the government's decision.
Okay, so good pickup, because there was one thing I didn't mention. So when we did our press conference, which was like a year or two into the study, the other thing going on was that Romania was making a bid to become a member of the European Union. And the first thing the EU said to Romania was, you need to deal with this issue of abandoned children. The second was the issue of graft. So they had some incentive to change the law. It wasn't just the study, it was also pressure from the EU. So as a result, they started deinstitutionalizing kids and started government foster care. But then, and this is I think the heart of your question, over time, when the economy started tanking, then they put less into government foster care. So at that point, and this is an issue that's come up before. Someone referred to us as lackeys for the government. But I don't know how many of you feel you have a lot of control over your government. In there, we felt what we did is we would, behind the scenes, work with all the relevant government figures that we thought could do some good. And we worked with non-governmental organizations. A woman, for example, who has gone in and out of government depending on which party is in place. So the way we've done it is to work behind the scenes to get them to give more support to those families. But our hands, we can only do so much, and we struggle with this all the time. It's not unrelated to Sandra's question. So if we had approached you as a family and said we have a 12-month-old we want you to take in, and we want you to commit to this kid for the next 17 years, very few families would do that. We call it adoption. So this is an issue that we've never completely been able to resolve to 100%. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, and one last follow-up. What is the endowment at Harvard these days?
May I ask why you asked that?
It's just a curious question.
I've lost track, but it's above 30 billion.
Okay, thank you.
If you want to write proof house and ask her to send some of that money to Romania, I'm with you.
I wasn't suggesting that at all. I was just curious.
Yeah. And they will tell you they need more. That was another joke. All right. This is bad. I have to explain the jokes. Maybe that is funny as I thought. So let me now I want to get into the data. I need to explain this issue of intent to treat for those of you who aren't familiar with this. The idea is to preserve the virtues of randomization, virtues being to avoid sample bias. So I randomly assign you to foster care and you to care as usual group, but over time, you change your group assignment. If I analyze the data based on where you are currently living, then I have sample bias because I don't know why you got to leave the institution or why you got to change your setting. So what we do is we analyze the data based on where you were assigned and where you were assigned, regardless of where you're currently living. And the reason that's important is that by the time kids got to be 12, only 14 kids still lived in an institution. The vast majority had left by the time they were 3 or 4 or 5 years of age, because the government came in and either reunited them with their biological families or put them in government foster care. But the data will be based on where you were assigned, which means it's a conservative test of the effects of early experience. Yes?
So none of these children were adopted internationally?
Oh, thank you. In 2002, because of pressure from a member of the European Parliament, they banned all international adoption, and they have not, I was going to say they haven't lifted that yet. The only qualifier to that is that if you're a Romanian extraction and you've moved abroad, you can adopt a child. But that's it. So there's a ban on international adoption that's been in place for 12, 13 years now. So there was no international adoption. Although I will tell you that when they said the exception was kids with special needs, they could be adopted. One of our kids, when Berlusconi was head of the EU, Berlusconi was the Prime Minister, all know who he is from Italy. He was head of the EU at one point. We know that one of our kids who was doing pretty well, got adopted into a family in Italy. So there was some politics going on in this law about kids having these special needs kids. Okay, so far? All right, so that's intent. So now let's start going through some of the findings. Start with cognitive development. We used the Bailey scales when they were very little. Bailey scales were like an IQ test scored on a population mean of 100, with 100 being the average. And If you look at the green, you're looking at the community sample, kids who grow up in families in the community, daily mental development index of 103, exactly the average. 64 for the kids in the institution, which is very, very, very low. What about the intervention? So if you look here, this is at 30, 42, and 54 months. The blue are the kids in foster care, and the yellow are the kids in the institutional group. And you can see at every age, the kids in foster care have much higher IQs than the kids in the institution. Some of you may be thinking that there's a drop from 42 to 54 months, but we changed our instrument from the WIFC to the WISC. And when we did that, the norms changed, so it's not a real drop. And if you look at the magnitude of the effect, it's the same at that age as it is at earlier ages. This is breaking down the data, though, by timing of placement. So this is the real question of sensitive periods. If you look here, the kids placed in the first 2 years of life, these are not statistically significantly different, are much higher than the kids placed after 2 years of age. And this is a theme you'll hear me talk about throughout the talk, which is the idea that there's a sensitive period here, and that kids placed before roughly 2, but it varies by domain, have better outcomes than the kids placed after 2. Language, for example, is closer to 15 months. Growth is closer to 12 months. So that's the sum. So the next thing we looked at was attachment. And the reason for this is that for years many people have said that kids who come out of institutions should show certainly disturbances in attachment, and in some cases severe disturbances in attachment. So the question is, attachment of a child to a caregiver could lay the groundwork for all subsequent relations with peers and with adults. And so perturbations in attachment early in life could alter the trajectory of other aspects of social and emotional development. So let me go through some of the attachment data. This is using the strange situation. Does this ring any bells to you? So the way this works is that a contrived situation where a child is with the caregiver in a room with some toys, the child's playing with the toys, the stranger walks in the room, you observe the child's behavior when the stranger walks in, then the caregiver leaves, and you observe what does the child do when the caregiver leaves. These kids are usually 12 to 18, 12 to 24 months. And then the stranger leaves, you see what happens, and then the caregiver comes back and you look at how the reunion. And a securely attached child, and those of you who've ever dropped kids off at daycare will recognize all this. A securely attached child will get a little closer to mom when the stranger comes in. When mom leaves, they protest. And when mom comes back, they seem really happy to see mom. Right? There are variations on this. An insecure attachment could be getting upset when mom leaves, but not really being thrilled, like giving her a cold shoulder when she comes back, or variations on that. So at first glance, what you can see here in the green is that 70% of the kids in the never institutional group have a secure attachment, and only 20% of the kids in the institutional group have a secure attachment. So that's coming right out of the gate. Now for the intervention, maybe I should stop for a minute. Here. The middle panel here is the critical issue here. These are kids placed in foster care before 22 months of age. And you'll notice that 70% have a secure attachment. Kids placed after 22 months of age, 70% have an insecure attachment. So the same general inflection point that we saw in IQ. The next thing, we wanted to look at a form of indiscriminate behavior when the kids get a little older. We came up with this task that we did at 54 months and at 8 years called Stranger at the Door. And it was a task that our IRB just had some trouble with at first. So here's how it works. We arrange with the caregiver or the mother that a stranger will knock on the door and that she should let her child answer the door. And then the stranger knocks on the door, the kid answers the door, and the stranger says, "Come with me, I have something to show you." So this is like every parent's worst nightmare.
You're not that clear.
You did. Chuck, this is at home, not in a laboratory setting.
Well, it's at home for the kids in foster care or in family care, and it's at the institution if it's for the other kids. So knock on the door, come with me, and we'll just see if the kid walks off with a stranger. Right? Every parent's worst nightmare. So if you look here, oops, sorry. 54 months. Institutional kids. 55% of the kids in the institutional group walked off with a complete stranger. If you look at foster care, it drops to about 25%. So we cut it in half. And there's one in the community sample that we've been monitoring this whole time. But even at 8, when it's common to go off with the stranger, you go to school, you still see the same slope. That it persists through the age of 8, that kids who are in the institutional group, and at age 8, only 20 still live in an institution. This is intent to treat. But at age 8, kids are still walking off with strangers. So kids randomly assigned to the care as usual group, the institutional group, are much more likely to walk off with a complete stranger than those in the foster care or whatever institutional group. Children randomly assigned to the foster care group show a reduction in such behavior, but not to normal levels. Yes?
Were there any particular characteristics that the stranger had, or like was it female or male, or?
Always females. But like, were you thinking scary or something like that?
No, I was actually thinking, were they like, I think, the kids in institutions are probably used to having young men around, so it seemed like sort of a usual person that they would interact with.
Yeah, good question. So what we did is I forgot how many strangers we picked, but we standardized it. So they said exactly the same thing, they behaved exactly the same way. But a hallmark feature of these kids is that if you walk into an institution, kids you've never seen will walk right up to you, sit in your lap, walk off with you, things like that, and that's precisely what happened here.
Yeah, so one of the things that I asked about one thing, so I work with a lot of kids in foster care, and I also actually work with them looking for data. One interesting thing that we were kind of thinking about is that there's this really high rate of friendliness in institutions, but at the same time, there's high rates of stranger anxiety. And so how do you kind of reconcile the fact that both of these things are going on? And so one thing I'm kind of thinking about is, are there maybe particular markers, like when institutional friendliness is happening, is it happening with people somehow safer in some way?
These are great questions. So first, I don't have to stand here now. I just sort of moved. First,
Can you repeat?
the question is, she works with kids in foster care, and you see a high degree of indiscriminate behavior like I just described. And then you also said you see a high degree of stranger anxiety. Separation anxiety. We don't see separation anxiety. What we see is this behavior that's very disconcerting. So I'll use Tommy again. So I'm a kid. She walks in. I jump into her arms, and the minute I get in her arms, I want to get down. The minute I get down, I want to get up. I want to get down, I want to get up. It's like I'm really ambivalent, and I'm going to show you a video in a little bit of this. So we don't see that. What's interesting about your comment is when I talk about this element of the study to people who work in the U.S. child protection system, they all say the same thing. Yeah, I see the same behavior in kids in foster care, this sort of indiscriminate behavior. And it's probably worse the more foster care placements they've had. And it's adaptive, right? What we've been trying to figure out is how to predict which kids do this and which kids do not. So I had this whole theory. So in another part of my life, for most of it, I've studied the development of face processing. How do kids learn to read faces? So I said, well, maybe they're not good at reading faces. They all look alike, so they go off with stranger. Nada. The only domain in this whole study where we don't show any effects is they can read faces. And they can read emotion, and they can respond appropriately to emotion. And I've never been more wrong in my life than in that one domain. So far, we haven't been able to figure out what accounts for why some kids are more indiscriminate than others, but we're working on that. Okay, so then we move up the scale. And now if we go into the domain of the DSM, we can ask ourselves this, what's referred to as a pathological form of an attachment problem, which is reactive attachment disorder. So there are two types of reactive attachment disorder. And I remember giving a talk like this in the psych department. Adrienne was gone now. In the psych department a few years ago, and got what the pastor was about to say. There's emotionally withdrawn and inhibited, and there's indiscriminately social or disinhibited. The first type are kids who, when confronted with a stranger, freeze. They don't move, and they're very, very inhibited. Versus the indiscriminately social, disinhibited, the kids that you and I were just describing. So here's the strange situation. This little guy is 12 months of age, and he's now in the room alone and playing with toys, and then you'll see what happens next. Any of you speak Romanian? All right. So that's the first time he's ever seen this one. And that's what we mean by indiscriminate behavior. Those of you who've studied attachment, and I kind of wish Marianne was around, you'll notice the one thing this kid did that's different than what you might see in your own kids is he got into her arms, but he didn't encircle her and hug her. He kind of did this, and there was this little bit of ambivalence, like holding on, but not really saying, I'm so happy you're here. And Charlie Zena has spent a lot of time coding these kinds of behaviors. And it turns out that most kids show some kind of an attachment. It's unusual not to have an attachment. We have 10% of our kids who have no attachment at all, which is really, really distressing. When it comes to the attachment disorder, here's what I wanted to share with you. So this is now the data all the way through 8 years. And if you look here, this is well, let's start here, these little diamonds. This is the prevalence of the withdrawn depressed type in the community sample. There's almost nothing there at all. If you look at the black circle one here, you notice that by 30 months, the kids in foster care, it's completely gone. It's completely remediated, this form of attachment problem. But if you look at the care as usual kids, the institutional group, they get better over time, but it never disappears completely. But this is very different than if you look at the disinhibited type. Now what you see, this is the never institutional group. It just disappears completely. After a certain age, they just are not indiscriminate. The kids in foster care are the black, and you notice that they don't differ so much than the kids in the institutional group. It takes them a long time, and by the time they get to 8, they're better, but they're nowhere near like the never institutional group, meaning that this has been much more resistant to our intervention, which was to put kids in a good family. And then, if you divide it by age, you'll notice that the kids placed under 2 years of age plummet by the time they're 30 months. Whereas it takes much longer. So earlier placement leads to faster improvement, but by the time they're 8, they're no different. And they're still higher than the never institutional group. So again, we see this sort of sensitive group. So it's now 2, and I was told we have until 3. I'm not going to talk until 3, but can I keep talking for like 10 more minutes? All right, 15 minutes?
Check it.
What about mental health outcomes? I'm always negotiating. What about mental health outcomes? So I'm going to talk about the data when the kids were 4.5 and when they were 12. The 12-year data are brand new. So let's start with 54 months. Care as usual, institutional group, foster care, never institutionalized. These are DSM criteria. This is a structured psychiatric interview we did. Look at more than 60% of the care as usual kids have some disorder, and it drops to 45% in foster care, and it's like very little down here. Notice the big difference, though, is in the behavioral disorder. No, sorry. I can't see this when I'm this close. In the emotional disorder, it drops from 45% in the care as usual to 20%. And what we're talking about there is anxiety and depression for the most part. High degree of anxiety, 45% of the sample, the criteria for anxiety in the care as usual group, it's cut in half by the kids put in foster care. Depression is cut in half. But we're not having any effect on externalizing problems or behavior disorders, as I show you here. So this is, that's the externalizing. And the other thing to note is most of the effect is carried by the girls. So girls benefit more than the boys do at 54 months. And the last thing I should say is that at 54 months, 22% of the care as usual kids had criteria for ADHD. And it was almost that high for the foster care kids. No intervention effect for ADHD. So at 12, we do this, and this is the list of the disorders that we looked at, and we just started looking at this. If you look at any disorder, again, you can see it's dropped from 54 months. That 35 to 40% of the sample have, and so in EIG in this case, is ever institutionalized. It's combining the care as usual and foster care, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. So these are kids who've ever been in an institution, that 136 original kids. Here's them, here's for internalizing, externalizing, and ADHD. And what you notice is that for any externalizing, which would include things like conduct disorder, or antisocial personality, or oppositional defiant disorder, disruptive behavior disorder, and for ADHD, the rate is much, much higher in the kids who've ever spent time in an institution. If you look specifically at ADHD, you see no intervention effect. Despite the way this looks, because I took the error bars off here, like we saw at 54 months, the rates of ADHD are still very high at 12 years of age, and we're not getting an intervention effect. It's a misleading graph, but trust me. So basically, then at both ages, we see a high prevalence of psychopathology among ever institutionalized kids. That at 54 months, we saw high rates of internalizing, and also an intervention effect, mostly for girls, to reduce internalizing. At 54 months, there was no intervention effect for ADHD. And at 12 years, internalizing symptoms have gone down. But ADHD and externalizing has remained high and remains resistant to treatment, in this case, foster care. What we're really curious about is, now that we're going to see the kids when they're 16, this is when you start to see a big separation between boys and girls in internalizing and externalizing. And so we're curious to see if we'll see a rise again in internalizing among the girls. So we'll have to wait and see. All right, so I'm going to now turn to brain, and then we're going to turn to policy, and then we're going to stop. So we've seen that the behavioral phenotype of the institutionalized child reflects alterations in underlying neural substrate. So we've done EEGs and MRIs on our sample. So we'll start with the EEG. Now let's just do this. We can take the EEG signal, it's a multiplex signal, we can decompose it into its constituent frequencies, and like alpha activity, beta activity, theta, things like that. And then what we can do is, with the electrodes along the surface of the scalp, we can create color maps that shows the amount of brain activity in different frequency bands. And so what you're looking at here in the top at baseline, institutional group, never institutional group. You're looking at it from the top down, with here's the nose, left ear, right ear. I took the axis off. As you move to the red spectrum, you're showing more brain activity. And what's obvious here is how much more brain activity there is over the frontal lobe in the never institutionalized kids compared to the institutionalized kids. So that's at baseline. Now, we'll go to 8 years. Same display, care as usual, kids placed in foster care after the age of 2. They're identical. Lower left, foster care before the age of 2, and lower right is never institutionalized, and they're identical. And remember, at this age, only 20 kids live in an institution. So what that means, again, is we see this inflection point, that placement before roughly 2 leads to much more moving kids closer in the direction of typical development. And then, this is very preliminary, we just did this. This is the 12-year findings. Now, different frequency bands can be interpreted in different ways. More alpha and beta is good, less theta is good. So if you look at theta, you see how much more theta there is than there is for the foster care kids and the never institutionalized kids. And the reverse, that there's how much less alpha there is in the care as usual compared to foster care and never institutionalized. So again, what this argues is we're still seeing an intervention effect. And what's important about this is that if you look at the history of intervention studies in the United States, like Head Start and Abecedarian, it is not uncommon for intervention effects to wash out after a certain period of time, and ours were not washing out. And our intervention was simply putting kids in foster care. Now, if we did the study again, which we're hoping to do, there's a lot of things we do differently. And one of them is, now that we know the sort of phenotype or the signature of the institutionalized child, we probably would do targeted interventions as well as placement in foster care. And if you're asking, we haven't finished processing these data yet, so we haven't been able to look at timing effects at 12 years. So that's sort of the summary. Lastly, brain, MRI. So when we first started working in Bucharest in 2000, there was one MRI scanner in the city. It was a 0.5 Tesla scanner, and it was used entirely for clinical purposes. Once it became a member of the EU, they discovered capitalism, and many private clinics sprung up that started having MRI scanners that private patients could pay for. So we started scanning our kids in a really very nice 1.5 Tesla Siemens scanner, and here is what we found. So this is total cortical gray matter. No intervention effect. Institutionalized kids and foster care kids show a dramatic reduction in gray matter compared to the kids in the never institutionalized group. For those of you who don't know what gray matter means, it tends to be dendrites and cell bodies, non-myelinated elements of the neuron. That's one way to put it. We do see, however, a small intervention effect on white matter, with the kids in foster care showing a little bit more white matter than these kids, but not nearly as much as the never institutionalized kids. So what that's telling us is that the intervention had no effect on gray matter, but is having a modest effect on white matter. And a theme here that, and if you looked at some of the slides carefully, you'll have noticed that in very few cases are the kids in foster care ever look as good as the kids who've never been in an institution. They look better, much better in some cases, than the kids in the care as usual, but we're not bringing them back up to the population mean. That could be because the average age of placement was 20 months, so which could be they were too old. And Rutter's work, kids adopted before 6 months look no different than their adoptive siblings. But as you move above 6 months, you start to see this fall off. So that's one possible explanation. And the other is that we did random assignment to foster care, but we didn't do random assignment to the institution, which realized you couldn't do. So there's a possibility that the limit we're seeing is a function of what brought them into an institution to begin with. Prenatal histories, biological insults, and the like. We have tried to get information on this to no avail. I had a wonderful medical student who's doing OB who went through all the labor and delivery records. She happens to be Romanian, although she immigrated to the US when she was little. We can't find anything in the birth records that's of any use, and we have no prenatal history. So we can't rule out some of these other factors. So the last thing then is the following. Having shown, I didn't tell you this, but the kids have smaller heads. They're not microcephalic, but they have smaller heads. We showed underpowered EEGs. Now we're showing smaller cortical brain volume, so they have smaller brains. What we're more interested in is the wiring diagram. So do we see sort of a compromise in the integrity of the white matter fibers in the brain? So when we did the MRIs, we also did diffusion tensor imaging on the kids. And this is when the kids were 8 to 10 years of age. And I'm only going to show you one data slide, because we looked at 40-something fiber tracks, and we'd be here forever. And this paper just appeared about a month or so ago. So, sorry. Give me 1 second. It's the problem when you play with your slides. I'm wondering what I'm doing. This is telling me what these areas are, which now in theory I should be able to tell from just looking. I'm not that good. So, singular gyrus, fornix, all right? What you see, and this is medial diffuse, so I want to explain what I mean. What you see is that these groups, never institutionalized in foster care, differ, and these groups differ. So this is sort of in between the two. Over there, you see a much more prominent intervention effect, where the foster care kids and the never institutionalized kids don't differ from one another. So let me try to put this in English. If we look at all these fiber tracks, what we see is there are some instances where there's no intervention effect, and there are some instances where there is an intervention effect. And what we're struggling with is, why do some parts of the brain benefit from the foster care intervention and not others? And it may have to do with the nature of the intervention and what that intervention does in terms of targets in the brain. But we have a lot of work to do here. And of course, we'll repeat all this when the kids are 16. So, exposure to institutionalization early in life leads to reductions in EEG power, reductions in gray and white matter, reductions in connectivity, effects of the foster care intervention. The EEG is remediated in most frequency bands, no intervention effect for gray matter, partial intervention effect for white matter, including volume and specific fiber tracts. So, children raised in institutions during early development demonstrate significant impairments in physical, cognitive, language, social, emotional, and brain development compared to community kids. Insofar as we've been able to look at our data, our model of foster care as an intervention appears to effectively ameliorate many of the negative sequelae of institutionalization, but not all. So for example, we don't see a reduction in ADHD, we don't see any benefit, with one exception, in executive functions. The exception is that we see some benefit in inhibitory control, but in all planning, cognitive flexibility, we're not getting an intervention effect. What's disturbing about that is that the kids were placed on average at 20 months. So does that mean those circuits are getting put together before the age of 2? And increasingly, although I won't talk about it, our brain findings are starting to explain a lot of our behavioral findings. So we've been doing these mediation models where we can explain some aspects of the behavioral data by looking at the brain data. So what I thought I'd spend the last few minutes on is the lessons we've learned from this in terms of the policy implications, and then maybe open that up to a discussion. So let's start with changes in Romania and the Hemisphere. So as I said earlier, 2 years after the project was launched and we announced our findings, the government passed legislation forbidding the institutionalization of any child under 2 unless they were handicapped. And in 2014, they changed the law to be any child under 3. Romania began to close down institutions. So in 1989, there were more than 170,000 kids. In 2000, it was about 100,000 kids. In 2013, it was 20,000 kids. Now that sounds good, but the reality is that they're putting kids in things they call social apartments or family settings, group homes, that are really just small institutions. But the big congregate institutions are gone. So it's a little misleading to say there's only 20,000 because some of them are environments that I still consider to be institution-like. UNICEF has used this project for now a number of years throughout the world to convince governments to stop putting kids in institutions and to close down institutions, which is very rewarding. There are also implications for clinical practice. So first, there may be a distinct signature or phenotype of the child who spends months or years in an institution, even though the phenotype is shared with other disorders. So here's an example. ADHD is common, and a colleague of mine, a developmental pediatrician, told me this story where this kid who came out of a Russian institution and saw a child psychiatrist and was diagnosed with ADHD, and they put the kid on stimulant medication, and the kid completely unraveled and got really, really ill. Was then seen by this colleague who realized that the kid suffers from an anxiety disorder that was presenting as ADHD. And you don't put kids with anxiety disorders on stimulant meds. But to the psychiatrist, ADHD is ADHD. She, on the other hand, appreciated the kid's developmental history and thought more reasonably it was more likely anxiety than ADHD. So that's part one. Should we consider something like an institutionalization syndrome, which is something Mike Rudder has been pushing? Or should we attempt to just treat the individual symptoms of the disorder, like the indiscriminate behavior? Second, the pathways that lead a child to present with ADHD may be different, etc. May be different in the previously institutionalized child versus the never institutionalized child. So different treatment strategies may be required. I don't know how many times a month I get emails from parents or sometimes treating physicians or psychologists about kids that they're seeing where they try the standard treatment for anxiety, depression, or ADHD, and it's not working. But that's sort of a problem in our field generally, not just here. But the idea is, maybe different treatment strategies are needed for kids with these unique developmental histories. Third, if being institutionalized early in life isn't bad enough, you have to also consider the child's prenatal environment. This is a big issue in parts of Eastern Europe where there's a lot of alcohol exposure prenatally. And what led the child to be put in the institution to begin with, which we often don't know about. So these factors could contribute to the extent to which a previously institutionalized child will fully recover. So if they go into the institution already with some negative life events, that may make it less likely that even put into a wonderful home with all kinds of great resources, they'll ever fully recover. Fourth, the earlier a child is placed in an institution, and the longer they spend in an institution, the greater the risk of derailment development. So this should be taken into consideration in placing kids in foster care or preparing families for adoption. What about implications for public health? So institutional care varies a great deal from region to region and country to country. Nevertheless, regardless of how good or bad an institution is, kids coming out of these environments generally have less desirable developmental outcomes than kids raised in families, again, assuming adequate families, and have certain things in common with kids experiencing neglect more generally. As you were saying, even in the US where neglect is far more common than physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. So for example, I was on an IOM committee 2 years ago on maltreatment. If you look here, kids in the child protection system, without a doubt, neglect is the most common form of child maltreatment, more so than everything else. Wow. So neglect is not a small issue, even in this country. And so the point then is that when I talk to judges and lawyers who work in child protection, the issue is how long do they let a kid stay in a bad environment? And how much attention are they paying to the environment the kid then goes into, like foster care? And then, how many times does the kid change foster care placements? Or how many times do they try to reunite the child with the biological family and have to keep pulling the kid out? And as a scientist, it's easy to sit on my high horse and talk about the science, but knowing judges and lawyers, their job is not easy. These are not easy decisions to make, but often they're made, I think, a little bit too cavalierly. So in this light, there's a lot of lessons to be learned here, not only for the 8 million kids who live in institutions, but for the millions who are at risk for child maltreatment, both abuse and neglect, and of course the millions who have already come to the attention of the child protection authorities. So the bottom line is we should learn from the science, we should inform policymakers and politicians and clinicians about the disadvantages of raising children in institutions, and let's inform the same groups that there are lessons to be learned from this study that extend to all kids at risk for substandard parental care. So the duration of time spent in early adversity powerfully influences development. The age the child is when they're removed from the adverse environment and placed in a good home is also critical in influencing their outcome. And early adversity can have lifelong effects on both psychological and physical development. So the first years are important. And let me just highlight one part about this last part. Blackboard, but the telomere region of the chromosome is the tip of the chromosome that protects the chromosome from its many cell divisions. So with the exception of our brain cells, when we can not only regenerate a skin cell, but we can regenerate our liver. But when our cells divide, the chromosome, the tip, this current telomere region protects it. And there's a model that with aging, it gets compromised, and that's probably why we start suffering from ill effects as we get older. But it turns out that you can accelerate telomere decline or telomere shortening with stress. So a study done about 10 years ago showed that middle-aged caregivers of kids with chronic disabilities lost the equivalent of 10 years of telomere length. And we've shown that the kids in our institutional group have shortened telomeres by the time they're 54 months. So the question is, if their cellular integrity is called into question, what will happen over the next 30 or 40 years of their life? Are they more prone to illness, cardiovascular disease, things like that? So that's something we have to pay attention to, because it isn't just the short-term effects of these adverse environments, it's also the biological embedding that occurs and affects long-term development. So now I will finally stop. Thank you.
So that was wonderful. So, those of us who live here in Los Angeles, our schema is so much how awful foster care can sometimes be. So my question to you is, well, two questions. It worries me that things that are really going to have implications for these young people's later life outcomes, like the ADHD and the externalizing, that you're not having any apparent intervention that's there. So it also leads me to wonder, are you looking at like school outcomes, like friendships, like the other important dimensions of good adjustment too? So that's my first question. And the second question is that you have the three groups. You've got the kids who stay institutionalized and never institutionalized in the foster care. And you don't disaggregate these foster care families at all. That's my bias about worrying about what foster care is like. And the argument is that I think that when you don't find change, you don't find any difference between foster care and institutionalized, you're making an implicit assumption that some things are really damaged early on in life, and getting out of this institutional environment doesn't lead to any improvement. But maybe some of those foster care homes are a lot better than others. So do you look at any interactions? I mean, moderating effect of quality of the foster care?
Are we done? Yes. That is one of my working memories, 2 questions.
Just 2.
The issue of peer relationships is really interesting, and we have 2 papers that speak to this. So the simple one is we just ask the teachers to rate the social skills of their kids. And we find 2 things, and the teachers are blind to this. The kids in the care as usual group are rated as much poorer in social skills, and it turns out the kids in foster care are better if they were placed before 2. But then we actually, this is Nathan doing this, we then did live coding of real interactions. So we pair a target child in the study with a kid in the community, not in our study, put them in a room with toys, we give them, and they have to play like 6 different games, and we observe them. And the kids in the care as usual group it's heart-wrenching to watch them try to interact. So you're the kid from the community. No, I'm the kid from the community, you're the kid in the institution. So we have toys. I come over and I make an overture like kids do to play together. And she just doesn't get it. So I keep making overtures and she gets weirder and weirder. And then finally I just give up and I don't look at her at all. So if you watch all of that, it's very disturbing that this is when the kids were 8. We did it again at 12, having looked at the data. So the kids' peer relationships are not very good at all. And now what we're worried about in their 16 is their intimate relationships as well. So that's part 1. I've already forgotten the second question.
The heterogeneity
Thank
of
you.
foster care.
So here's what we did. We were able, 2 things. Using this measure of caregiving quality, we established that the caregiving quality among our MacArthur foster care families was as good as the kids in the community. But then as kids started getting drained off and put into government foster care, we got concerned. So we looked at the kids who stayed in our foster care versus the kids who went to government foster care, and sadly, the kids in government foster care are not doing so hot. They're better than the kids in the institution, but they're not nearly as good as the kids in our foster care. So there we have the foster care effect. And their government foster care is very similar to ours. So I think that's the key issue there. So if you're going to build foster care, don't cut corners, right? But we don't need that. Yeah.
So I had actually pretty much the same question in terms of thinking of the government version of foster care as usual, and then what you did is this enhanced foster care. So I'm wondering if you're making the case in papers or anything, or speaking about sort of what you did and how that type of foster care that you implemented, the supportive element, as something for policy.
Yeah, so a way to view that is how would you bring something like this to scale? So what we've done is first it's manualized. Second, we've written about it extensively so that it's open source. People can see precisely what we did with that foster care program. Sadly, what Charlie Zena tried to do is export what we did in Romania into New Orleans, which said something about the foster care system in New Orleans. So we tend to think of it as the Cadillac, the Lexus, the Tesla of foster care, what we did. Clearly there'd be room for improvement. But the heart of it was relationship building. Because we assumed that it was a psychosocial, the kids in institutions experience deprivation of many, many things. But it's the lack of psychological investment and psychosocial deprivation that we think is a big part of this. So that's why Charlie set the foster care program up to really emphasize the building of relationships. So that's what the social workers worked with the families. Does that answer your question?
So I did read a few of your chapters from the book, and they were great, but I want to ask would stay here and continue visiting the child. Did you find any differences based off of the reason for why they put the child in?
Okay, so that we don't know why they put the child in, but what we're looking at are there are families who not only visit, but they take their kids out. So I didn't mention is that 30% of our sample are Roma gypsies. And I think many of you, hold on, this fell off the microphone. Many of you have read about the Roma issue in Europe, like when France threw them all out, they always done the same thing. Huge cultural, racial bias against the gypsies. So in that culture, many gypsy families would abandon their kids and say for a year or two, and then they go back and they take the kid out for a few months. We had one recently where the kid was 12. We did our 12-year follow-up. The family came in, was the first subject we saw in the new follow-up, so they could get their money, and then they took the kid out of the institution to move to France so the kid could beg on the streets. So we have not analyzed our data really to look at these effects because of the obvious reason that, we have not publicly discussed our analysis of these data for the simple reason that we find that the Roma kids do less well across the board than the Romanian kids. And if the government gets their hands on that, they'll just say, well, we knew that. You know where I'm going with this. So it's an issue that we're struggling with. There's another hand up on the left side. Maybe not. Okay. Scott.
I have 2 questions about the brain. I don't want to teach word connecting too much. One question
You have
is...
2 questions about the brain.
One question is, does smaller brain size necessarily mean that there's a problem? So women have smaller brains than men, but they're not less smart than they are they? Number 2.
What's your second question?
In those EEG plots you were showing, there was a lot of frontal activity in the never institutionalized kids and a lack of it in the... And so you'd really predict that if there were any effects, it would be on executive function, but you said there really weren't any effects of executive function.
The plots I showed you were for beta activity, or I can't remember if it's beta alpha, but the point is that it may depend on the frequency band. So let me start with the second question, which is a much safer question, which is that Scott's asking a really important issue, which is, can we use any of the brain data to explain or account for some of the behavioral profiles, including executive functions? That's the one that's haunting us. So we're trying to figure out, so what we're doing now is using the DTI data and looking at, say, either medial diffusivity or axial diffusivity or fractional anisotropy to look at whether in frontal cortex or connections between frontal and anterior ear states, that correlates with some of the executive functions that we have. We're just starting that now, so I don't know the answer to that. The second is, how does EEG power generally relate to some of the cognitive skills? Now, we know it relates to IQ generally, but we haven't yet looked at the executive functions, which include, in our case, planning and set shifting and inhibitory control and working memory. Those are the 4. Because we're getting there. But those are really important questions. Now, brain size. So, in all seriousness, on the one hand, we know brain size doesn't account for function within limits. If you're microcephalic, it's something else entirely. But brain volume itself it's really not that different than head circumference, right? It only accounts for so much. But we've been able to document a loss of cortical volume in gray matter. And what I'm worried about is that is it a loss of synapses or a loss of cell bodies? Now, admittedly, I'm sure we can afford to lose some percentage of these things with no effect on function, but there may be a tipping point. So what we're doing is scaling the volumetric data continuously to see what the inflection point is when we see a dip in some behavior. And that's the way we're going to approach that. Because the brain behavior part is the most intriguing aspect of the study. It's not just the main effects on behavior, the main effects on brain, it's how the two relate to one another, which is, I think, the heart of what you're asking. Schools of education, everyone says I have 2 questions.
Always a challenge when you at UCLA, but the mic, by the way, we turned off long ago, so just so you know.
It's just I can't hear you, that's why I'm standing up.
Okay, so
This is just like fake. Okay.
So one question is, the left institutions before 2 years of age. Did they have differential mental health outcomes compared to those who stayed longer?
Great question. The answer is no. We have not seen any timing effects in any of the psychopathology data. And we're kind of surprised at that. And we don't know what to make of that, so we're working on it. The gender differences were also eye-popping. It's the only place in the whole study we see differences between boys and girls. So no, we haven't looked at that yet. Second question.
The other one is, you mentioned Charles emotional traits at the start of your talk, and obviously with the high externalizing rates with your older kids, it seems likely that there's some of that, but I wasn't sure if you would measure that specifically or not.
Yeah, at 12, on the disc, we are measuring callous and emotional traits, and we're working on that now. Now, I'm a little over my head here, but my understanding is that there are some models out there that posit that a pathway to callous and emotional traits is through really disturbed attachments early in life. And I know so far we have at least 5 kids who meet criteria for callous and emotional. And these are the kids who are threatening to kill their moms or their sibling or something like that. And this is the one we're keeping our eye on because this is really disturbing. And we don't know how that will change. The other thing that it could interact with is we're interested, we brought Larry Steinberg into the project now because Larry's an expert on adolescent development, and we're interested in risk-taking in these kids because given the profile we've described, there's a high probability that these kids will engage in high-risk behavior. And that could include substance use. So that's a bad combination, substance use and a tendency to callous on emotional traits. So we're going to have to keep our eyes on all this, and this is why we're really, the 16-year follow-up just started like last month. So it'll be a couple of years before we have any idea what's really going on.
Yeah, I was thinking about so you screened for fetal alcohol exposure.
By a physical exam. So by physical exam, the kids did not have any of the physical traits of fetal alcohol.
So you ruled that out in that healthy group of 100.
Yeah.
You're confident with that?
No. Before you even go on, so here's why we're paranoid. We had a pediatric nurse practitioner and a pediatrician who screened every one of these kids, and when they screened them, not one kid had the facial dysmorphology associated with that. But we've now taken pictures of all the kids, and we're having a pediatrician scoring it for FAS.
Yeah. And?
Because she hasn't done it yet.
Oh, okay.
But the reason is that you can't be too sure,
I know.
right? And so just because they did a physical example is, we think one of our kids has Fragile X, which we can't confirm with blood, because we can't get blood. And we think one of our kids may have a touch of CP. Both of those kids weren't detected in the pediatric screen. So we'll see.
But you are tracking them in alcohol and substance use now with the kids.
Yeah, let me give you an example of this that just was really disconcerting. So in this institution for teenagers, there's a unit within the institution of kids who go out at night and abuse drugs, and then they come back and sleep during the day. And they're 15 to 18, and it's mostly inhalants and glue. I mean, it's not good drugs. And when I asked the other kids who live there what they least like about living in that institution, they're terrified of these other kids. And they let them because by law, they're allowed to stay in the institution until they're 18 or 21 if they're in school. So the kids are kind of in school. So and a lot of kids will leave the institution when they get to be later adolescent and live on the streets, live in the sewers, where they then use a lot of drugs. So that's a concern on the road.
Curious and ignorant about a lot of the Romanian social policies, but you started with some pretty restrictive, conservative policies around child rearing, and I was just curious if you could tell us where the social policy landscape is now, and any of that has shifted.
Yeah. I mean, that's all changed. So that there is a wonderful documentary, we're blanking on the name of it, about abortion in Romania. Can you I just saw your face. Do you remember what it's called? It's like a number or something like that. What did you?
4.5.
Something, yeah.
Yes.
Right.
It's very, very good. I'll give it to you.
It really,
Thank you.
I mean, it's very powerful because it took place during this time. So that's all gone. I mean, the birth rate now is slightly above 1. Birth control is readily accessible, abortion is legal. I mean, it's nothing like it used to be. So that's quite different.
It's 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Is that the movie? It's not a documentary, but it's a
Yeah.
really vivid
Yeah.
portrayal
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
like 1980s Romania abortion policy.
Yeah. And there's another one about kids living in the subways in
It's
Bucharest.
like children
Whoa.
underground.
I've seen that.
Yeah, yeah. So what's interesting about your question, though, is that this was an experiment in social engineering, right? He went out of his way to create this world with he was a shoe cobbler, which I guess is, how different is that than being an actor before you become president, right? But he had no expertise here. And so, but we have lots of examples in our history of people who come up with social engineering experiments. So when we dug into this, I had this really wonderful undergraduate, also Romanian, from Orange County, actually. Her parents immigrated to, that's near here, right? Harvard paid for her to spend the entire summer getting into libraries, in government libraries that we couldn't access. Of course, we couldn't read Romanian. And she did her senior thesis on this. And there's a sociologist at UCLA whose name I'm blanking on now, who's written a wonderful book on the whole cultural history of Romania before 1989. So when you read it, it's like a time warp, but it's also like reading about the Pol Pot regime, right, or other things like that. And but people just went along with it. Was that kind of your question about?
Yeah, I was just curious, I mean, it is social engineering, but it's also the idea that he wanted people to have kids, but then what do you do when you have all these kids? in
So
society
here's
and
what's
people
interesting
can't
about
support
that.
them?
What we've always read and been told is that the idea was to create a more loyal workforce, right, increase the population. But we heard a rumor once that he was actually trying to create something like the Stasi, that he thought that these would be government agents. Now, what was misguided about that is, do you want government agents with IQs of 65 and externalizing problems? Well, maybe, I guess.
Yeah, that's.
Do what they're told.
Well, I mean, one of the things that would be great from your work is that we can reduce the number of institutions for special needs kids, which are still a huge problem around the world, and that kids with special needs are still institutionalized everywhere.
Right, so let me say 2 things about that. First, you shouldn't leave here thinking that the United States doesn't institutionalize kids. There's thousands of kids in the US, call it residential care facilities, but these are usually special needs kids who can't find a foster care placement. And second, the number of institutions so there are kids in institutions who become handicapped by virtue of being in an institution. And then there are institutions specifically for kids with mental and physical disabilities. And there's a group that publishes an annual report. I forgot the name of it. It's like human rights. Right.
Yeah.
That does reports about this. And the mistreatment. I mean, the film I didn't show you are these kids in this institution that were basically thrown away. They were all seriously handicapped, and then they were left there to die. And even in our institution where our lab is based, in 1990, there were 1,000 kids in this institution. There are 6 districts in Romania. It's kind of like the arrondissement in Paris where you have rings of districts. And there are 6 districts, 6 institutions. We drew from all of them to avoid sample bias. But ours was the biggest. And I found a logbook that documented every kid who came into the institution from 1893 to 1935. And the mortality rate over that period of time was 50%.
Wow.
So half the kids who entered that institution during that period of time died.
Right. I have a book called The Procession of Them, which is about institutions around the world still.
End on a positive
So,
note.
yeah, let's do a positive note. Well, I don't know. It's something to think about, that it's right.
This came up last week. So after Nim and I talked, this woman said, "Can you guys say anything really positive?" And we said, "No, not really." But here's the positive part. As someone who considers himself mostly a scientist, It has been tremendously rewarding to see the science translated into policies so quickly. And to see UNICEF cite this as the best evidence to date to close down institutions is rewarding. The problem is that it's a generalizability issue. Someone told me in South Africa, they'll say, oh, we know all about that study, but those are Romanian kids, they're not South African kids.
Right.
So
So we can only hope. All right, that was fabulous.
What's your name again? Naeem. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I was wondering. Thank you, Card.